Hello everyone, this is Emily, and today I'm really excited because I'm going to talk about one of my favorite books, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. This book was published in 1847, and if you have not read it, I have some notes in front of me and I will give you a brief synopsis. This is the Gothic tale that follows the life of Jane Eyre, orphaned at a young age, as she seeks to find her place in the world. She is brought up in an unloving home of her aunt, and she is bullied by her cruel cousin. Jane then leaves this home, hoping that Lowood Home for the Girls will be better. However, there she endures unfair treatment and social isolation. Grown and ready to leave the school behind, Jane posts a job to be a governess and travels to Thornfield, where she will look after the young girl Adele. It is here that she meets Mr. Rochester, the enigmatic and capricious master of the estate. Mysteries of Thornfield rise as Jane hears an evil cackle, and fires are started by creeping figures in the night. Jane finds herself torn between her feelings for Mr. Rochester and her strongly held principles. If you have not read this book yet, I strongly recommend it. It is my favorite book. It will keep you turning the pages to learn more. I know I was intimidated when I read it, but you just want to find out what happens to Jane in her life because the prose really has a way of entrapping you in that story. I've now read it a few times, and every time I read it, I get something new out of the story. So I will leave you with that. I'm going to discuss it now. So if you have not read the book yet, I don't want to spoil that experience for you. So you can go ahead and do that when you're ready to read the book. But now I'm going to discuss some of the major themes that I found when I reread the book this year. Right from the first sentence, I think we are introduced to the idea of walking and how it's so important to Jane. So the first sentence begins, "There is no possibility of taking a walk that day." And I found as I reread this book that walking is something that is repeated throughout the novel. And Jane walks and goes on walks whenever she is feeling a frustration and an urge to go somewhere beyond where she is currently. We find Jane walking within the chamber of her small room in Lowood as she desires for more, as she desires for liberty and freedom. And here, I'll read this line for you. This is Jane. "I desired liberty. For liberty I gasped. For liberty I uttered a prayer. It seemed scattered on the wind, then faintly blowing. I abandoned it and framed a humbler supplication. For change, stimulus. That petition, too, seemed swept off into vague space. Then I cried, half desperate, grant me at least a new servitude." And it's after this part in the book where Jane walks around her room that she posts the advertisement for the governess job. She continues to walk in Thornfield Hall as her restless spirit is still longing to be free. And here is that quote. "Then my sole relief was to walk along the corridor of the third story, backwards and forwards, safe in the silence and solitude of the spot, and allow my mind's eye to dwell on whatever bright visions rose before it." So we see that Jane has so much passion inside of her and so much desire to be beyond her current circumstances that she just has to let that energy pour out of herself. And she's often walking in order to do that. And I thought it was important to note that once Jane makes the difficult decision that she must leave Thornfield and Mr. Rochester, and she knows that that is the right thing to do, she wakes up early in the morning and she walks away. It is her legs that carry her away from Mr. Rochester and towards finding her freedom. Another aspect of this book that I find really interesting is how each character defines love and what love is, what love means to them. Mr. Rochester introduces the idea that love and jealousy go hand in hand. So when he begins his discussions with Jane at one point, he says, "You never felt jealousy, did you, Miss Eyre?" "Of course not. I need not ask you, because you never felt love." And it is interesting because jealousy is what actually makes Jane aware of her feelings for Mr. Rochester when she believes that he is going to marry Miss Ingram. That is when Jane really feels strong jealousy towards Miss Ingram and realizes that she really cares about Mr. Rochester and she wishes that she was the one that was marrying him. And also we see jealousy with Mrs. Reed. As she is dying and speaking to Jane, she talks about how she felt jealousy of her husband's care for Jane and that led to her mistreatment of Jane when she was a child. We also see that there's this passionate, somewhat supernatural pull between Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre. And I think this is one of my favorite quotes when Mr. Rochester says to Jane, "I sometimes have a queer feeling with regard to you, especially when you are near me, as now. It is as if I had a string somewhere under my left ribs, tightly and inextricably knotted to a similar string situated in the corresponding quarter of your little frame." And later on in the novel, when Mr. Rochester calls out to Jane in desperation, Jane, who is miles and miles away, hears the call and is able to respond, and somehow they're able to still be connected to one another and find each other again. And I think that this passion is really interesting when you put it next to Jane and her relationship with her cousin St. John. St. John proposes to Jane, and his proposal is more of business than marriage. He wants to go and serve in the mission field with Jane, and he thinks that she will be useful and she is hardworking and diligent, and for all of those reasons they are meant to serve together. But Jane is enraged by this, and she says, "I scorn your idea of love. I scorn the counterfeit sentiment you offer. Yes, St. John, and I scorn you when you offer it." I think that throughout the novel, Jane shows that she enjoys serving and helping others. We see that time and time again. And being useful is a large part of her identity and purpose. However, that is not enough to sustain Jane in her relationships. She sees this idea that St. John presents, but she longs for the passion and love that she feels for Mr. Rochester, while also helping him and being his caretaker for many years after they do get married, as we learn in the end. And the final theme that I want to talk about is emotions and control. So different characters that we meet in the novel have different ways of expressing their emotions. And I'm going to focus on 3 characters in particular. Let's start with Jane. She's the protagonist. We see that she is a passionate person. She experiences turbulent emotions throughout the novel, but she also has this sensibility about her. And I think this quote perfectly summarizes Jane and how her emotions and her thinking process works. So, after leaving Mr. Rochester's room the night that she saves him from the fire of the curtain, this is what goes through her mind when she is alone in her own room. "I was tossed on a buoyant but unquiet sea, where billows of trouble rolled under surges of joy. I thought sometimes I saw beyond its wild waters a shore, sweet as the hills of Beulah, and now and then a freshening gale, wakened by hope, bore my spirit triumphantly towards the bourne. But I could not reach it, even in fancy. A counteracting breeze blew off land and continually drove me back. Sense could resist delirium. Judgment would warn passion." And I find that this is a defining characteristic of Jane. While she is passionate and she has all of these emotions and she feels the world with a great sensitivity, she also has this sensibility and this judgment that kind of grounds her. It's kind of like an anchor. We also have Bertha in the novel, who is kind of a symbol of emotion that is entirely unhinged. She commits acts of violence, and through her we see that emotion can be dangerous and unleashed. And then on the other side of that continuum, we have St. John, who is seen by Jane to be cold and calculative. He is very quiet and analytical, and he never really shows an outburst of emotion, as many of the other characters do throughout the novel. And what the novel really delves into is the idea of uncontrolled emotions and the idea of locking up emotions. In Jane's childhood, when she is locked in the red room for misbehaving, she is sent there and told that if she is quiet, she will be let out. However, inside of the room, her emotions and her imagination are only heightened, and her fear and frustration can only increase until she hits her head and passes out. She can't find comfort alone in the room, and that is very similar to Bertha and how she is locked away in the secret room of Thornfield. Bertha has fits of violence, she attacks people, she sets fires, and her emotions are locked away, where perhaps, like Jane, in her experience, she finds no peace. And I think that it's really interesting to note that Bertha doesn't leave her marriage to Mr. Rochester until she destroys both Thornfield and herself in the fire. She burns up. But Jane leaves, I guess, the situation and everything with Mr. Rochester under the influence of her reasoning mind rather than her emotional state. So I think that the book kind of opens up a discussion about making decisions in an emotional state versus a rational one, and using sensibility like Jane does. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the ending, which honestly, the first time that I read Jane Eyre, from the point that Jane left Mr. Rochester to the point that she was reunited with him, I didn't enjoy that chunk of the book, and I didn't see the point of it. But rereading it, now I can see that that's really where we see the character of Jane come into her own and grow. I think that it's in that part that Jane finds her family, and she finally feels like she belongs somewhere, something that you've seen her longing for. But she also becomes independent. When given the opportunity by St. John, Jane opens a school, and she is able to have a lot of autonomy in running the school and having her own small household that she can keep. She also inherits a fortune from a wealthy relative, and that can sustain her financially and allows her to be independent. So I wanted to open up a discussion about the ending because I know a lot of people interpret it in different ways. After telling the reader about her marriage to Edward Rochester, Jane does tell us that his sight returned 2 years into their marriage. And now they have been married for 10 years and have children. She also keeps in touch with her cousins. And the last piece of news that Jane leaves us with is that St. John, who has worked zealously and stayed unmarried, writes to her about his readiness for death and returning for God, and her own emotional reaction to hearing this from him. I'm personally still mulling over what I think about the ending. I personally find it really interesting that the last sentence and the last part of the book is dedicated to talking about St. John. Maybe it's Jane mourning for him. I can't tell. So I would love to hear your reading experience and what you think about the ending. Jane Eyre is probably always going to be one of my favorite books. I have so many notes about it. It's just a great book. So if you have read it as well and have any thoughts about the ending or any other themes that I did not talk about, I would love to hear about those in the comments down below. Until next time, happy reading.